What if the United States never purchased Alaska? Imagine a world where the vast expanse of Alaska's icy mountains, rich natural resources, and strategic location were not a part of the United States. Instead, envision it under the control of Russia, or even as part of the British Empire. How would this change the geopolitical landscape? How would it impact the US economy, its cultural identity, and its global standing? Decisions that might seem insignificant in the moment often carry consequences that reach far beyond their time. This thought-provoking exploration delves into the alternate realities of an unclaimed Alaska, presenting policymakers with crucial discussion points about foresight, leadership, and the influence of strategic opportunities. In 1867, Secretary of State William H. Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia for just $7.20 million, a sum that seemed vast at the time, but today equates to roughly 2 cents per acre. The purchase was not met with unanimous support. Critics dismissed it as Seward's folly, viewing the land as a barren wasteland of ice. However, the US government saw an opportunity to eliminate Russia's territorial presence in North America and to secure vast territories for expansion, trade, and potential resources. Russia, on the other hand, deemed Alaska a far-flung liability. Struggling to defend such a distant land and fearing it might eventually fall into British hands without compensation, they willingly sold it to the United States. But what if this transaction had never taken place? What if this decision was avoided due to financial skepticism, a lack of urgency, or global political hesitations? Let's reimagine the world in a scenario where the US never acquired Alaska. Had Russia opted to retain Alaska, the implications could have been monumental for future conflicts and geopolitical dynamics. Throughout the 19th century, Alaska was more of a strategic outpost than an economic asset for Russia. However, technological advances and the discovery of gold and oil would have eventually turned this northern territory into a major boon for the empire. The most direct geopolitical consequence of a Russian Alaska becomes apparent when we consider proximity. Alaska sits less than 55 miles from the mainland US at its closest point. This would have been a source of heightened tensions during the Cold War. Imagine Soviet military bases stationed in Alaska, missiles aimed just across the Bering Strait, facing down American forces in a perpetual standoff. The US defense strategies during the 20th century would have required a massive overhaul to counteract an immediate threat. Moreover, a wealthier, resource-rich Russia with access to Alaska's oil reserves, gold deposits, and fisheries might have had the economic leverage to influence its imperial ambitions. A stronger, wealthier Russia in the late 19th century also could have rewritten history by modernizing its military capabilities or even delaying internal revolutions, such as the Bolshevik movement. If Russia had decided to sell Alaska but opted for a different buyer, namely the British Empire, the effects could have been similarly transformative. At the time, Canada was part of the British Empire, and an acquisition of Alaska would have cemented British influence over the northern hemisphere of the Americas. In this scenario, Alaska would likely become a Canadian territory. The US-Canada border, already a point of contention during the 1800s, would gain an even larger frontier with the British Empire entrenched just across the northern boundary. How might US-British relations have evolved in this context? Would negotiations over the sparsely inhabited territory remain peaceful, or would war erupt over territorial control? A scenario reminiscent of the War of 1812? British control over Alaska might have thwarted US ambitions to extend its dominance both economically and militarily. The Arctic Circle, with its emerging significance in global shipping routes and natural resources, would today be a playground for British-Canadian interests rather than a key domain of American influence. Alaska's rich natural resources have been central to its value. The discovery of gold in the late 19th century set off the Klondike Gold Rush, transforming the region. By the mid-20th century, the discovery of expansive oil reserves made Alaska a keystone of the United States' energy independence. Without US ownership, who would have tapped into these resources, and how might it have shifted global economic balances? If Alaska had remained underdeveloped due to Russian financial difficulties, or if Britain had opted for slower resource extraction, the Alaska we know today might still be a pristine, untapped region. However, foreign exploitation of the land could have also fueled wealth for competing powers. For instance, a resource-rich British Empire or a financially stabilized Russia might have wielded greater influence during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. The loss to the US would be twofold: missed economic growth and weaker leverage in the energy sector. Alaska's oil pipelines, alongside its other booming industries like fisheries and forestry, have played a vital role in US prosperity. Without them, rival powers could dominate these industries and reshape the global economic order. An often overlooked aspect of the Alaska Purchase is the fate of its indigenous peoples. Before the transfer of power in 1867, Alaska's native populations lived under Russian colonial policies, which often prioritized fur trading and religious conversion. Under US governance, these communities experienced a mix of neglect and integration, as well as significant efforts to preserve their cultural identities. What would their lives have looked like under continued Russian rule? Or under British colonial administration? Russia struggled to maintain control over Alaska's sparse settlements, often abandoning smaller communities, leaving indigenous populations vulnerable to exploitation. Britain, on the other hand, might have imposed stricter policies of assimilation, mirroring practices seen across Canada. Under US governance, Alaska's indigenous peoples achieved a unique identity despite challenges, gaining visibility and autonomy in the late 20th century. Would this progress have occurred under other regimes, or would their cultural heritage have been eroded? Alaska represents both the rugged spirit of American expansionism and the country's diversity in terrain and culture. The acquisition of Alaska, initially seen as unnecessary, eventually became a foundational element of America's self-image as a nation that could thrive in even the harshest environments. Without Alaska in the American fold, much of this identity might lack its northern frontier charm. Movies, literature, and even environmental protections tied to Alaska's pristine wilderness might never have entered American cultural consciousness. Yet under different ownership, Alaska could have remained an alien and inaccessible landscape, further isolating its natural beauty and distinct culture from the world. Alaska serves as a crucial environmental reserve in our modern world. However, if left in Russian or British hands, environmental conservation might have played out differently. Straddling the Arctic Circle, Alaska is vital for studying climate change and managing fragile ecosystems. Would alternative ownership lead to aggressive exploitation of natural resources or stricter preservation policies? Russia's history with Siberia suggests a potential for over-industrialization, while the British Empire might have adopted an approach prioritizing imperial resource management. Strategically, Alaska's location near the Arctic has only grown in importance as new shipping routes open due to melting ice caps. Who controls Alaska determines global access to these routes, influencing trade logistics and international diplomacy. Under different geopolitical hands, the US might have had to negotiate from a position of military or economic weakness. Revisiting the hypothetical world where the US never purchased Alaska surfaces a critical question for decision-makers. How do leaders evaluate the long-term importance of seemingly insignificant decisions? In 1867, many doubted the wisdom of investing millions in a frozen, distant wilderness. But the foresight of individuals like William Seward illuminates the value of strategic vision, even when public sentiment is skeptical. Policymakers today often face similar dilemmas about investments in territories, industries, or technologies that might not yield immediate gains. How do we evaluate risk versus reward when the outcomes are uncertain? Alaska's story reflects the importance of seizing opportunities that could influence a nation's trajectory on the global stage. History also shows that decisions taken, or avoided, guide the evolution of global power balances. Looking back, the refusal to purchase Alaska could have left the US at a military and economic disadvantage, potentially reshaping the 20th century's most defining moments in war, diplomacy, and development. By exploring the hypothetical absence of the Alaska Purchase, this video urges policymakers to reflect on how history's decisions continue to ripple through time. It challenges contemporary leaders to weigh the implications of action versus inaction and to consider the latent opportunities hidden in even the least likely decisions. The Alaska Purchase is not just a historical moment. It's a vivid reminder of the enduring impact of visionary leadership. As we face challenges in resource management, territorial sovereignty, and environmental stewardship, it stands as a lesson on what can be achieved when foresight triumphs over skepticism. What other opportunities might we be overlooking today? What happens when nations hesitate to act on decisions that could alter their future? The Alaska Purchase highlights a pivotal truth. The cost of inaction may far exceed the risk of seizing the unknown. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.